Well, first, I think I should begin with a disclaimer. I'm certainly no expert on longitude, but at this very moment, I'm the victim of it. I assure you. So if I nod off in the middle of this, I have an excuse. And I'd also like to say, Sophie's comments really set this up rather nicely. We hadn't spoken about this at all until a moment ago. So let's just then begin with something you may recognize. In this distress, we had, besides the terror of the storm, one of our men died of the calenture, and one man and the boy washed overboard. About the 12th day, the weather abating a little, the master made an observation as well as he could, and found that he was in about 11 degrees north latitude, but that he was 22 degrees of longitude difference west from Cape St. Agostino, and so that he found he was gotten upon the coast of Guyana, or the north part of Brazil, beyond the river Amazones, toward that of the river Orinoco, commonly called the Great River, and began to consult with me what course he should take, for the ship was very leaky and very much disabled. So begins Defoe's tale of lament and discovery, of the threat of storms and sudden isolation, of a time when navigation seemed entirely to depend upon skill and experience and very little upon scientific credit or knowledge. Defoe's story, as all of you know, is one of the many fictions of travel and adventure with which the 18th century abounds. It is also much more, being concerned fundamentally with the cunning of invention and survival, waiting, of course, for Providence to intervene. Early modern attempts to secure new lands also required the capacity to overcome the limits imposed by nature. New places particularly meant computing new times. Lives depended on it. In some cases, this was true also of reputation, which is the theme of much of what I wish to say today. Our accounts of conquest of nature as of empire, in all of those, the search for longitude is not unreasonably a tale of inventors demanding recognition and of instruments found wanting. Navigational devices thus had a trajectory that, like a carpenter's chronometer, ultimately resulted in acceptance, however reluctantly, or ended, as they often did, in cheap smirks at the madness of their creators. And you saw some reflection of that, actually, in Sophie's illustration. There are many instances where proposals to discover the longitude seemed no different than extracting nitre from Maydew by the alchemist Thomas Hinshaw in the Restoration, reported, by the way, in Spratt's History of the Royal Society. Similarly, with sunbeams from cucumbers in Jonathan Swift's Academy of Legato, whereupon, after 8 years, presumably after privatizing sunbeams, it was anticipated that sunshine could be provided at a reasonable rate. I mean, it seems to have echoes, if you don't mind me saying so. Now, not all of these things made such easy satire. Nitre into gunpowder was serious business. So too was Swift's lament among the Wyndham's regime in England in the 1720s, where, and I quote here, "Vast numbers of our people are compelled to seek their livelihood by begging, robbing, stealing, cheating, pimping, forswearing, flattering, suborning, forging, gaming," it goes on, "lying, fawning, hectoring, voting, scribbling, stargazing, poisoning, whoring, canting, libeling, freethinking, and the like occupations." So for those in the know, of course, satire was a great deal more precise than such easy targets. And I want to make, if I may, a rather modest proposal, that we might change our lens slightly, or at least alter the polarity a little bit. Early receptions of schemes of longitude allows us to navigate the early modern realms of credit and credibility, and yet historians of science have often, in my view, run aground. It's facile to pick up the well-known doggerel verse that Ditton and Whiston may both be persist on, and Whiston and Ditton may both be beshit on. Facile. We've all heard it. And on the other hand, there are plenty of proposals for the improvement of navigation that induced frustration. These, I think, should not be relegated simply and easily to the realms of fantasy. They were just as often means of projecting fortunes even without the specially legislated reward as set out, following, of course, Whiston's proposal in the Longitude Act in the summer of 1714. There were, I propose, other forces at work. I could go into this at great length, but let us just say that as a Stewart star faded, not this one, replaced with a Hanoverian one, and the British state navigated financial crises while fending off Jacobites, there was a lot going on. The growth of the fiscal state and the resolve of navigation were widely understood as necessities. Hence the Longitude Act of 14 as much as the Bubble Act of 1720. It is proved, unfortunately, very easy to dismiss some of the more crack-brained schemes, such as the ones that emerged immediately after Whiston set his wish in print. I'm going to give you a few examples. Take, for example, Francis Haldane, who published an attempt to discover the longitude at sea, probably an immediate response to the Act, but which has been variously dismissed as naive, politely. Addressed to James Stanhope, Secretary of State, the notion was to calculate the ratio of longitude to latitude by sailing 45 degrees to the equator against a grid that had been previously provided. In spherical geometry, this might have had some kind of minor mathematical merit, yet of course it's dismissed and impractical because of the problematics of ocean currents and changing weather. But does that adequately explain the amusement or the dismissal? I'm not so sure. Likewise, take, for example, John French, who is entirely typical of this culture of connection. In 1706, French had succeeded in convincing Prince George to order sea trials of an absurd apparatus. A mathematics teacher, French, had attempted numerous ways to try to take advantage of the concern with longitude. As soon as the Act was passed, French applied to the Royal Society, not to the board, but to the Royal Society for its approbation of a method that was intended by fire to adjust magnetical determination of latitude. By 1716, French was still attempting to circumvent the Act by way of a petition to the Crown for funds to build the necessary instruments. His perfect discovery of the longitude at sea, published in 1715, seemed as preposterous as a perpetual motion machine. So Newtonian notions notwithstanding, this is not as critical as an objection as you might now assume. It might be worthwhile pointing out that not only were perpetual motion machines taken seriously throughout the 18th century, but well into the 19th, the British Crown was still granting patents for such devices. So principles of natural philosophy were not always guarantees of credibility. Hitherto, focus has often been on the apparent follies of William Whiston, Humphrey Ditton, and so on. Again, numerous examples. Almost immediately, when R.B. in his longitude to be found out with a new invented instrument complained of Whiston, that if he has anything such as brains, they are really crap. There are some hilarious moments in these stories. One of the most interesting attacks, however, based at least on some seaborne experience, came from someone I've come to know quite well, Case Billingsley. Billingsley understood, as did many, that finding longitude was hobbled by the lack of an effective timekeeper. Musing about the improbabilities of Weston's rocket ships, Billingsley asserted that nothing much could be seriously accomplished without some means of reducing the shocks that made any timekeeper unreliable. His answer was essentially a stabilization platform. He received very little support, and it has been since reduced to the company with a host of crank theories. Billingsley seems to now have joined the buffoonery. This fails seriously to recognize his significance as one of the most inventive geniuses on the tides of Augustan credit, coinage, insurance, and the Navy. In other words, what I'm proposing is that longitude was not left entirely to lunatics. I propose we simply pay rather more attention to them in the context of the longitude hunt, even to the many unworkable schemes, rather than simply be seduced by satire. In the search for longitude, much might be decided ultimately by assertions of support. And again, I could give you many, many examples of precisely that. The idea of giving out credit, Mario Biagioli has written a great deal about this. It's about the deposit of observations and discoveries that assert the truth-telling in the philosophical trade that the Royal Society practiced. It's a period of immense and I think really significant epistemic transition. And yet at the same time, empiricism seems completely insufficient despite anything that Locke might have had to say about it. This is a clockwork universe, but it's one that doesn't work. So how, in that circumstance, could reasonable judgments be made about the claims of inventors? In a highly stratified and highly connected culture like that, the answer seemingly depends on the credibility not of the inventor, but of the supporters of the inventor. Indeed, as Biagioli argued, authorial claims made dependence on personal judgments more critical than factual evidence. This divergence was notably true in navigational testimony, where the effects of distance are chronic and unavoidable. I can testify to that. In such circumstances, the credibility of claimants to the longitude mattered a great deal more than testing of devices. And that seems to me to raise some pretty important questions. The search for longitude depended on their supporters, and because of this, I think, we've got a situation where there is a mix in the culture of innovation of longitude and lotteries, mysterious inventions, shadowy promotions. They all share common haunts, and that is, I think, literally true. It's a remarkable observation of London's early 18th century that the activities of geographers and navigators were focused on the dens of financial and insurance manipulators, such as Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley. This was the hangout of Herman Moll, who 2 years before the Longitude Act had published a view of the coast, countries, and islands within the limits of the South Sea Company, which was critical, in fact, to the absorption of the national debt at the time. But here, too, were to be found Billingsley, Weston, Ditton, fellows of the Royal Society like John Harris, James Hodgson, and dozens of proponents of Newtonian natural philosophy. Now, the image of these dens is not always helpful. One might ask, what would it profit those whose claims were contrived and carried on with all the art and cunning possible to amuse people and draw them in by a false view of immense claims? There were too many fakes and frauds. As the mathematician and former assistant to Flamsteed, James Hodgson, remarked, the grail of the longitude overheated too many imaginations. Hodgson warned, shortly after the act, people that go on upon new discoveries ought first to make themselves masters of what is already known, and what are the principal things wanting to render the means more effectual. This would prevent them from spending a great deal of time to no purpose, and enable them better to succeed in their attempts. Despite all that, all too often longitude was carried along on a tide of perpetual possibilities. Hudson was very much aware of what was going on. As early as 1705, he published a 500-page survey called The Theory of Navigation Demonstrated, including a collection of the latitudes of several ports and cities with their longitudes from Her Majesty's Observatory deduced from celestial observations. He had left the Astronomer Royal in 1702, and he ended up giving mathematical and experimental demonstrations in Exchange Alley. Now, there's a little about his particular experience now that seems to remain, but we do know this, that navigators, traders, insurance men in Cornhill and Threadneedle Street were obsessed with the limits that longitude imposed on their schemes. It made sense for Hudson to lay this all out in a lengthy explanation of mathematical technique and a list of latitude and longitude for major seaports. Of course, that's really not going to help very much if you're sailing far beyond into uncharted waters, but still he's trying to lay out some data. What was the answer? Was it as simple as was once said in the 17th century of turning plowmen into philosophers? Was it that simple? Well, maybe mariners into astronomers or something of that nature. Lots of examples again. The mariner Robert Rowe in 1703, again before the Act, applied to the Royal Society for having his notions from long study and experience nonetheless rebuffed by no one less than Flamsteed. Even before the Longitude Act, the Society had played a very significant role in determining the value of the innovations and claims that were being made. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Weymouth watchmaker William Hobbes, in correspondence with William Durham at the Society at least since 1709. Like Rowe, before him Hobbes attempted to interest Flamsteed in a proposal for a spring to balance the movement of a pendulum on board ship. He received very little encouragement. And yet within months, Hobbes revised his earlier approach, and then this time grasping for the approbation of the Royal Society, but this too was a failure. Flamsteed apparently had seen an early version of the pamphlet and it discouraged the Royal Society from bothering to respond. The whole point here is that the search for longitude was beginning to look like a grand lottery. All you needed was the assertions of someone to buy you the ticket, to get you in the door. Within days, literally within days of dealing with Hobbes, Flamsteed received a similar yet more elaborate proposal for a stabilization platform from the hyperactive and hyper-inventive Case Billingsley. Billingsley, like many, relied on patronage, and not altogether that successfully. Flamsteed took some time to show him that the pendulum would be shaken by every shock and motion of the ship, and in the company of some very intelligent persons assented to what I urged. He held his peace, which is as much as I can expect from persons that have swelled themselves with the hopes of getting £20,000. Turned out Flamsteed was overly optimistic. 16 years later, Billingsley, then from a debtor's prison near Utrecht, was still insisting that his scheme was preferable to any that had been proposed by Edmund Halley, and moreover, that if the Longitude Board proved uninterested, he was still entitled to a patent. Billingsley then set all of the wheels this time in motion. He was actually pretty desperate. He contacted the Earl of Westmoreland, Sir Charles Wager, Admiral of the Blue, to intervene on his behalf with the king, arguing that his system of stellar and lunar observations was sufficiently accurate that by a set of easy and certain calculations and careful observations with my timekeepers, I can make so familiar to every master and mate of a ship that in a moment they shall correct their longitude to half a geographical degree, or 35 miles, or 2 minutes in time, which is the nearest the Act requires. Some echoes of Whiston didn't hear. begging to be supported, and this time contacting Lord Torrington, who, by the way, had been on the Chauvel disaster in 1707. He summed up his dilemma for many. And this, I think, in a way, really sums up the problem. For if I am not introduced to a person of worth and weight, I am apprehensive that our great men's despair of this discovery will make them unwilling to consider my scheme. There was one way in the door, and that was knowing someone, in his view. Well, many, many such examples, of course. Here's one more. Robert Brown, Methods, Propositions, and Problems for Finding the Longitude in 1714. He'd attempt to receive the support of General Stanhope. Failed. By 1731, he was trying yet again, and this time he claimed that Halley had declined inspecting my improvements and making a report, and he'd been told by the Commissioner for the Longitude to make an application therewith to this honourable society, the Royal Society, and were of opinion that the gentlemen of this honourable society would certify to their lordships as the merits of my improvements deserved. The whole process was pretty tedious, but nonetheless the Royal Society seems, in the minds of some, to have held the key. Stephen Plank, another one, both in 1714 and 1720, wrote pamphlets claiming to have found, no less, the only method for determining longitude by watches. Well, the proposals were beyond the technology, although he did not, as has often been assumed, disappear from the scene after damaging his instrument at sea on a voyage to Jamaica. By 1731, guess what? Planck is back again, this time trying to petition to the Royal Society to examine his quadrant with a speculum that enabled sighting of objects on the horizon and determining their latitude. He was supported by a large number of witnesses, some of them pretty close. One that you may be rather more familiar with is, of course, the mysterious figure of the Welsh physician Zachariah Williams, who again tried to exploit connection. In this instance, of course, much of what we know about him is the connection with Samuel Johnson. What's really interesting about Williams, from my perspective anyway, is that Williams attempted to get around the problem of the board, or even the society, by creating a joint stock for the discovery of longitude, or by a patent for the sole making or vending of all instruments related to the proof of the discovery of the aforesaid longitude. Well, there were many, of course, now ignored false hints simply because they were false. What was harvested from the reasons given by Whiston and Ditton in 1714 was not nearly as perhaps what we might have expected. On what basis, actually, could longitude be assured? The answer is a very tricky one. It's complicated by the context. The end of Anne's reign, with the twists and turns of competition with the French and the Spanish, the whole issue of navigation is not only about strategic matters, but it's also about commercial competition. The urgency at that time of a credit collapse, worries following the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, magnified the concerns of British trade while security hung in the balance. And under the new Hanoverian star, even the South Sea stock continued to inflate. That seemed like a pretty good bet from the point of view of the government, but it was a very, very thin thread as it turned out. Commercial reputation of chartered companies depended largely, as Defoe had predicted, on the power of imagination. Same is true of longitude. No wonder improvements to navigation always seemed so necessary, and yet so ethereal, suspicious, and ripe for satire. So many claimed the solution, and so many depended on the references of gentlemen of credit within the Royal Society. But these were also men, and this is something I think is often forgotten, these were men whose fortunes themselves were drawn to the fiscal state and its foundations in the Royal Exchange. Between the society off Fleet Street and the exchange in Threadneedle Street, there was a track frequently followed. Between those coordinates, reputations were ripe for ruin. So Swift, in an attack which was really on the Whigs, would warn not to mistake the echo of a London coffee house for the voice of the kingdom. In this, the Longitude Wars were also a part. Hence, that explains the attack on Whiston. Indeed, the fiscal addictions of the state to private investors and the lamentable state of navigation demanded more than ill-informed answers or unending suspicion. The only defense of an innovator was connection. Even if we were to take, even if we accept at first blush as an assertion made by someone like Locke, that it was not the authority of witnesses but the skill and integrity whereby they conveyed their knowledge, observations, and experience, even if you took that at first blush, it's vain to be discovered amongst the denizens of Exchange Alley. Quite the contrary. So behind the satire and behind the things that are so readily dismissed, one thing that was not changed, and that you could not, even on Locke's principles, amend the cunning of innovation, as all of those applications, particularly to the honourable gentlemen of the Royal Society, even now reveal. Thank you for your time.